If you're new to our channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.
Right.
Well, Holly, let's go to the Ivy Organics 3-in-1 Plant Guard hotline and bring on our next guest.
Yeah, Jill Mcsheehy is a stay-at-home mom with a blog, podcast, and online gardening course that she has developed to help herself and to help beginner gardeners find their way. Welcome to the program, Jill.
Hi, Joey and Holly. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on the program, taking time out of your busy day to enlighten us and to share some of your garden wisdom with all of us and our listeners.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
So you began this journey in 2013. So just, less than 5 years ago or 5 years ago. What inspired your journey and your very first garden?
Well, I started gardening because that year I became a stay-at-home mom after working in management at a Ford dealership for a decade. And going down to a one-income family, that was really, the grocery bill was really the only thing that I could control at the time. And so I decided to cut the grocery budget, I would try to grow my own food as much as possible. So I really started it from a very practical standpoint and just grew to love it.
Now, going into this, how much knowledge did you actually have about gardening or any at all?
Well, that's kind of a funny story because when I was growing up, my mom had a garden, but I have very few memories of it because I just didn't care. And she kind of joked with me that one day when I was a teenager, she asked me to go pick a pepper, and I asked her, "What's a pepper?" So that kind of gives you an idea that I had no experience whatsoever in gardening when I started.
So with no real knowledge of produce identification here, what was your experience once you got started? Did you think going into this would be successful, or was you kind of in the back of your mind going, "I'm going to take a shot at this. I don't expect anything to work very well or at all"?
Well, I actually had pretty high hopes, and I think it's because I'm a pretty good student. Like, I've always enjoyed research and learning, and I pretty much spent that whole fall and winter studying how to grow a vegetable garden because I'm kind of a research nerd like that. So I really did expect to have a successful garden just because I know how to follow directions. There were some unknowns that when it comes to pests and diseases and things like that, I didn't know what I would have to come up against in my own garden. But overall, I think I was pretty ambitious and I had pretty high expectations.
Now, and you did your research and figured out, or at least tried to understand what may happen. Now, you're in Arkansas, correct?
Yes.
So based on your region of where you're living, you're going to experience different insects that are bad than we here in Wisconsin or you in Arkansas. So that one article doesn't answer all the questions of what bad bugs am I going to experience in my vegetable garden.
Exactly. And it was very overwhelming because when you're studying about all these things and reading the books and they say, well, you could have, these 101 different pests, and I didn't know which ones I would have. I didn't know anyone who was actively gardening, so I didn't really have anybody even to ask to have any idea what to expect. So I think I just tried to do my best and then thought, this first season I'll figure out what I'm up against when it comes to pests and diseases.
Definitely.
What are some of the first resources that you said you looked online, did some research? Where did you go first to help new gardeners who are beginning? What's some locations? Well,
Actually, you're going to laugh at this. My favorite two resources was Vegetable Gardening for Dummies and the Everything Grow Your Own Vegetable book. So those were just the very basic, just because I didn't know where else to start. Of course, now I see that there is a plethora of resources available now to new gardeners, way more than I ever found then. So there's lots more available today, but those were the two that I really got started with. And then another one my mom got me for Christmas that year was put out by, I believe it was the University of Arkansas Division of Agriculture. They had their own handbook called Vegetable Gardening in Arkansas. And that really helped me to understand more how specific plants will grow well in my area, timing of planting, things like that. That was very helpful from a locally specific standpoint.
Definitely. Now, what is one or two mistakes you made that now you look back and they seem like maybe you should have known better? Like, hey, Captain Obvious, I probably shouldn't have done that.
Well, that's kind of a hard question because when you're just beginning and you don't have any knowledge to begin with, you don't know what you don't know. And looking back, I really tried to do my best, and what the mistakes that I did make, I don't know that I would have known better. I think the biggest mistake I had the first season was we had actually planned the garden plot in the fall, and I covered it with newspaper and wood chips to be able to do kind of a back to Eden sort of gardening method. And everything was ready in the spring, and then we got all the spring rains, and it was underwater. And I didn't realize in the summer and the fall that was a low place in my yard. And so probably in mid-April or so, which is right around when we try to plant things here in Arkansas, my husband and I just went and my dad bought me a tiller, and we completely changed the garden location. So that was one thing we had to do the very first season, just to be able to plant somewhere that wasn't constantly saturated with water.
Now, whenever you did your research, obviously, when we tell people that want to start a new garden, grow what you want to eat, but you have to grow what can be grown in your area. Was there any surprises that you found that, hey, I can grow this, and we do like eating this particular item?
I think for me, this may seem simple, but green beans was one thing that I wanted to grow, and everybody in my area, it seems like, that did garden, they could grow green beans, but that was one thing I never even saw my mom growing. But one thing also was potatoes, and I don't know why I decided to grow potatoes. I'd never seen anybody grow them in my area. Of course they do, I know now, but that was one thing that worked out really well for me in my area. It's so many things, actually, that I was able to try worked out well. It's the cooler season crops that we really struggle with, and that's one thing that I've learned on the opposite end, that some things are a lot harder to grow, and some things are pretty impossible to grow here in our area.
So when you decided to put this garden in, what was the layout? Did you decide, hey, I'm going to go big or go home, or I need to start small, or what was the mindset with the decision that was made on that?
I went really big. I think my first one ended up being about 2,000 square foot, and that was the total of my in-ground beds and my raised beds. And the reason for that was because I wanted to grow food for our family. I wanted to grow enough tomatoes to can our own tomato sauce, green beans to have enough green beans to last all year. I really wanted to grow with abundant production so that we really could make a dent in the grocery bill. It wasn't just a hobby for me. But I do recommend for beginners that to start small, because it was definitely a huge learning curve that first year with having so much space.
Well, you were able to stay at home, too, and kind of make this your job. So if people have a full-time job, that kind of really limits the amount of time that they can dedicate to a very large garden that they may not know how to manage.
Absolutely. I don't think there's any way I could have done anything of that scale when I was working a full-time job. I think it worked out really well for me, though, because coming off of working full-time for over 10 years, right after college, I already had this, go, go, go type mindset. And so because I was so used to working so much, then I came home, I was able to pour that into the garden. And so that was a pretty easy shift for me. But for people who are just trying to get into gardening for the first time and they're trying to add it into their busy schedule, I definitely recommend starting small and then expanding as you're able to.
Definitely. Now, you did choose to grow in raised beds. You do some in-ground gardening, but you have a few raised beds. Why did you choose to go with those raised beds?
Well, I think a big part of it was that I wasn't quite sure how our ground soil was going to be. I did a soil test that fall, and it had a very low pH, like a 4.8. I knew I needed to amend it just from the research that I had done. But I also knew just by going in the garden, that our soil was very high in clay content. So I started the raised beds that I did because I figured that I could control the fertility and the tilth of the soil better. And I was right. And the in-ground bed has definitely been a work in progress, and it's doing better every year of amending the soil and all that, but it's definitely been a longer process, whereas the raised beds I was pretty much able to produce well right away.
Right, that 4.8 would have been great for blueberries, but for actual vegetables, you really need about a 6.8 to 7.2. And if you don't have that, there's ways of bringing that pH up. But if you don't have a good pH, you're not going to have you got to have a good foundation in order to have a good structure. And you didn't have that, and you were aware of that very early on.
Yes, and speaking of blueberries, my blueberry bushes are amazing, as you can imagine, with that acidic soil. But yes, I went ahead and limed it, and I do things every year, and I did a soil test last spring, and it was right around 6.5, so it's really at an ideal range now.
So, Jill, how can we find out more about you? How can our listeners find your podcast that you go in depth and step by step and help people not make the mistakes that you made your first journey into this gardening world?
Yes, you can reach me on my website at journeywithjill.net or the Beginner's Garden Podcast, which you can get on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcasting apps, either one.
Very knowledgeable, very easy to understand. You make it into a language that any level gardener can understand and not feel intimidated by the instructions that you provide.
I definitely try to do that because that was one thing, 5 years ago, I really struggled with finding that beginning gardener advice. Of course, I think that it's a lot more available now that I'm in it more, but I definitely want someone who has zero knowledge like I did to be able to come in and say, I can do this, and just kind of walk them step by step of just the basic things that, some people just don't talk about. If you've been experienced gardener, you don't realize how basic things need to be when you're first starting.
That is absolutely correct. Well, Jill, we greatly appreciate you taking time out of your day to join Holly and myself and sharing all of this wisdom with us and our listeners.
Thank you, Jill.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be on.
Absolutely. And thank you for checking out the Wisconsin Vegetable Gardener radio show. For more, go to the WisconsinVegetableGardener.com for full-length in-studio video and podcast replay of Season 1. Season 2 underway and added weekly. Tweet us at TWVG Show or hashtag TWVG to be part of the program.